Welcome to the Emerald City Sportscast, hosted by longtime Northwest sports journalist Dan Viennes. News, analysis, and opinions from Dan and his guests on the Mariners, Seahawks, Kraken, and more. And now, here's your host, Dan Viennes.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to see if I can remember how to do this. It's been a minute, right? What's been going on? Anything happening in sports? So we've been talking about some of this stuff for over a year now, right? Of all the times for a story to break, such as, I don't know, an all-time great, not just Seahawks player, but Seattle sports icon, like Russell Wilson's on the Mount Rushmore, right? If you take all sports into consideration, he's on the Mount Rushmore. So when would this news break for someone like me? Yeah, on the road. Was on the road, driving over Stevens Pass, and all of a sudden my phone blows up because there's a lot of people that I know that I'm their first call when something like this goes down. I was out of town for a couple of days, having a wonderful time. Had great company and some great time away from just life and stuff. And so what a way to get thrown back into it. Russell Wilson traded to the Denver Broncos for a let's just call it a crap ton in return. I'll give you my thoughts on that finally. Had to take some time and kind of digest all of it. And there was a lot to digest on Seahawks Twitter the last couple of days about what the next move is. I will give you my plan A, B, and C for how I would like to see the Seahawks address the roster as a whole, but in particular the quarterback situation moving forward. Let's start with this. If you've listened to this show, or if you follow me on Twitter, or if you know me personally, you know that for the last year, and we've talked about it to death on the show with guests I've had on as well, we talk about levels of fandom, right? And there's a certain level of fandom where the fans get more attached to the name on the back of the jersey than the front of the jersey. And they can't accept change. We saw that last year with KJ Wright. A revered player, good player on the field, but also a guy who really took care of things off the field, really represented the organization the way you want a player to, right? Active in the community, never got in trouble, just everything that you want out of a pro athlete. Nearly everybody that was a Seahawks fan last year wanted them to bring back KJ Wright, except for the people that were diehard about the X's and O's part of football. KJ's best days were behind him. The idea of bringing players back out of nostalgia just doesn't usually work. We've seen that here in a number of ways. We saw it with Ken Griffey Jr., maybe the best example. You know, they carry him off on their shoulders after he hits a home run on the last day of the season. The second time they brought him back, he's an aging player, hit 18 home runs that year. Everybody's excited to bring him back for one more year. There was nothing left in the tank, and he ends up leaving the team in the middle of the day and driving to Montana. KJ Wright signed with the Raiders and then went out and proved on the field that while he could contribute, he wasn't the player that we thought he was, and it was the right move for the Seahawks to move on. We'll get to Bobby Wagner in a second because it's a little more extreme case than KJ Wright. Not exactly apples to apples. But in the case of Russell Wilson, we've been talking about this for a year, and the type of fan that I'm talking about, I've engaged with them almost every day on Twitter for the last 365 days, and they refuse to believe that there was anything to the Russell Wilson trade talk, even last year when he opened the door himself. And I came on the show numerous times, and I told you that I had it on good authority, direct sourcing from people involved in the NFL, high-ranking officials, that not only was there fire where there was smoke last year, but there were some really tense moments. And there were some moments last year when the Seahawks were fed up with what Russell Wilson was doing publicly and would have accepted a trade if the right one came along. It did not. And the timing wasn't right. You know, they really thought they were on the verge last year, if they had a decent offseason, to be a contending team. Someone would have had to really blow them away. And that Bears offer that got so much publicity just wasn't it. So then fast forward to this year, And there's still speculation, even though things were a lot more quiet on the Western Front. We didn't hear anything from Russell except, I want to be here. We didn't hear anything from the Seahawks except, we don't intend to trade Russell Wilson. Everything was quiet, to the point that I even tweeted early last week in response to someone else who was getting on a national reporter for continuing to talk about this when there was nothing there. I agreed with him. I said, look, this was a story last year. It's not this year. So let it go. Well, they fooled me, because now we know that the Seahawks and Broncos have been talking for a matter of weeks, almost a month. This has been going on for a while, even predating the combine press conferences where Pete Carroll and John Schneider got up there and said they weren't intending to trade Russell Wilson. So why now? And why do I think it was the right move? And then I want to put that into context as well. His value was never going to do anything other than decrease after April of this year. 2 years left on his deal right now. And then he can always franchise him, of course. The salary cap is going to be going up exponentially over the next couple of years. Takes a big jump this year after COVID wrecked it the last 2 seasons. So with 1 year left on his deal next year, they weren't going to get nearly what they got from the Broncos. So that's part of it. The other part of it is I think the Seahawks, for the first time in 4 or 5 years, really took a long, hard look at themselves in the mirror, did some of that self-scouting we hear about, and were actually willing to be honest with themselves. I thought Pete Carroll said something a week or so ago, I think it was at the Combine, that I thought was really telling. And he was speaking specifically in response to a question about the defense and the changes they made on defense, not just in moving on from Ken Norton Jr., bringing in Clint Hurt, Sean Desai, but also in scheme changes. And some of the things Clint Hurt talked about that they're going to do strategically, tactically, as far as the scheme goes, that run counter to what we've seen from Pete Carroll. And Carroll said, we got kind of arrogant in the way that we were going about putting our roster together. I thought that was some rare humility from Pete Carroll. And I thought that was telling, because they admitted basically that they thought they were better off than they were. And I think you can take that quote and you can apply it to the quarterback situation. And that's why, and I've had this debate multiple times this week. You know, when I went back to work, it was all anybody wanted to talk to me about. And most people were surprised that I wasn't crushed by this. If you listen to the show, you know that I wasn't. Love Russell Wilson. I got a closet full of his shit. I'm not probably going to wear it again until he retires. But love the guy. Love everything about his story. You can still Google, look up the story I wrote on NFL Mocks, who I was working for at the time, when he was drafted. And I was one of the first people, I think, to come out and say, hey, this guy's got a legit chance to be a starter. This was a genius pick. I've been a supporter of him all the way through. I've had my issues. You can go back 3 years to the LA Charger game here at home, where it might have been one of the most emotional episodes I ever did, because I thought he flat out lost us a game that we should have won because he just made terrible decisions and played poorly. And I've had issues with how he conducts himself off the field and how that kind of takes over his legacy, and just how he seemed at times to be more concerned about his brand. And I think that might have led to where we are today. But there's no question how great of a player he was. Limited, right? You have to do things differently when he's on your roster. Denver's about to find that out. And we'll get to that in a second. But the time was right because he wanted out. Now we know that. That not only did he go to the team, learned his lesson from last offseason, though, did it quietly. So quietly that it fooled me. Let them know that he wanted to be traded. Let them know that Denver was his preferred destination. Now, the other reason this was the right move at the right time is because what we got from the Denver Broncos, hard to turn down. And it's not just about the picks. There's some significant players involved here, too. Shelby Harris is going to be a major contributor on the defensive line, which is an area that needed to be addressed this offseason. Noah Fant gets me really excited. He's a guy I loved in the first round. Reportedly, the Seahawks loved him. Denver took him right ahead of us. It's a guy that can be 25 years old, can be a Pro Bowl caliber tight end at a position where Gerald Everett is a free agent. Will Dissly's a free agent. Now, I think you can let Gerald Everett walk because Fant's a more similar player, more of a move tight end. He'll be a weapon in the pass game. And now you'd like to bring Will Dissly back, a little bit more of a two-way tight end, a guy who can help at the line of scrimmage. So it was significant from that standpoint, too. Seahawks have the number 9 pick in the draft right now. Haven't had a pick that high since their first draft with Russell Okung and Earl Thomas. So it'll be fascinating to see what they do with that. I get to study top 10 prospects now. Haven't done that in a long time. An extra second. So there's a lot of 3 of the top 41 picks in the draft. 4 of the top 72, I think. So the offseason just got a lot more fun. A little more money to work with in the salary cap. They already had the second or third highest amount of salary cap space in the league going into free agency, which starts Wednesday. And now they have picks. So the timing was right. Russ wanted out. The return's significant. Here's where I want to make a really a strong point. And this is where I mentioned earlier that people were surprised I wasn't crushed by this. Some people have a hard time separating these two ideas. You can believe, as I do, that this was the right trade to make and that trading Russell Wilson right now was the right thing to do. Not the least of which also is 35 years old into the declining years. Denver's not going to get his best years. We got those. He's a declining player whose physical skills were a huge part of the tool belt before. Those are going to decline. We've seen it already. It's begun. And he's going to get more expensive. And I know the salary cap goes up, but quarterback salaries are going up faster than the salary cap is. Russell Wilson's going to want $55, maybe $60 million a year in 2 years. So you take that into consideration as well. But it is possible to believe that the trade was the right thing to do and also still acknowledge that there's no guarantee this is going to work for the Seahawks. This could be a disaster. People could lose their jobs over this if they don't make the right decisions in the next 12 to 24 months. Or let's say 14 to what am I trying to say? The next 2 to 14 months, this offseason and next. They don't find the next quarterback. If they don't get back to being a competitive playoff team by 2023, it's over, most likely, for Pete Carroll, John Schneider, especially if the team gets sold. And there's been renewed talk that that is in motion and will happen sooner rather than later. So that's the camp I'm in. Getting rid of Wilson was the right thing to do. But this could be ugly for a while. This might go terribly wrong. But I'm kind of twisted. And I like this stuff. And if you listen to me before, you know that I do. I like the team building stuff. I like the offseason stuff. And so I can't wait to see what they do. You can talk all you want about bad drafts the last 4 or 5 years. You're probably not as right as you think you are, actually, when you take a closer look. And picks that didn't really go their way. It's a lot harder to pick at the end of the first round than it is at the top. It's pretty hard to screw up the number 9 pick these days. Pretty hard to screw it up. Now, one other piece that came back in the Denver trade is we get Drew Lock. Still just 25 years old, the 41st pick in the draft 2 years ago. Warranted consideration going into his final season at Iowa or Missouri. Iowa. One of those black and gold teams. Had been talked about going into his final season as a top 15 pick. 6'4", has a cannon of an arm. Quick release, pretty athletic for his size, moves around pretty well. He's a competitor. He's fiery. He's kind of fun to watch. He kind of says whatever's on his mind, which is a stark departure from what we've seen out of Russell Wilson. To the point that there's a classic headline where one time he said something along the lines of, about 50% of the time when I throw the ball, as soon as it leaves my hand, I go, oh no. So we'll see how that works out. But there's a lot to like about Drew Lock, and you can make an argument when you watch the tape that there's some similarities to Ryan Tannehill. Tannehill, big, strong, talented, no question about that. nobody that was a Miami Dolphin fan thought he was going to be the answer. And so nobody was upset there when they decided to move on from him. Resurrected his career in Tennessee. Not an elite quarterback, but a guy you can win with, and Pro Bowl level, borderline. I think that Shane Waldron in that offense sees some things in Drew Lock. If you can squint and imagine the Rams and what they do, what they tried to do with Jared Goff, what they do with Matthew Stafford, you could see Drew Lock in that system. And you can certainly see him throwing bombs to Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, assuming they're on the roster opening day. That'll be another discussion for another time. But don't think that Drew Lock is the answer to this. The Seahawks didn't make this trade thinking, okay, we're good. Drew Lock's the next guy, and we'll take it from here. Not the case at all, but there might be something there, and it's worth looking at. It doesn't really cost you much. But if you see enough that you like this year, depending on other acquisitions at the position, you can exercise his fifth-year option and keep him around a second year as well. Another interesting part of this moving forward it'll be fascinating to see what Wilson does on the field in Denver, and also how long the honeymoon period lasts. It'll be interesting to see how long it takes for Denver fans to get disenchanted with how you never get anything out of the guy. Just his disingenuous interviews and press conferences, and what a waste of time it is to listen to those. Will he be better in a different system? Nathaniel Hackett, the new head coach there, coming over from Green Bay, presumably to run a similar type of offense to what Aaron Rodgers runs in Green Bay, behind a different offensive line. Or will the bad habits that drove us crazy continue to plague him in Denver? And I'll submit this, could it get worse? Because now he's emboldened. Now he knows he got his way. Now he's the man. Now he knows what Denver gave up to get him. And with a first-year head coach, it'll be fascinating to see how that works out. So now what? Okay. That's the big question now, especially with free agency starting next week and then the draft coming up in a couple of months. Lots of talk this week. First, let's get this out of the way. Lots of talk this week about Deshaun Watson. There was the Daniel Jeremiah quote on his podcast where he said every NFL contact he has expects Deshaun Watson to end up with the Seahawks. This makes no sense to me. Forget about the sexual assault allegations. That's enough of a reason to not want him in Seattle. And I saw polls yesterday. You talk about polarizing. I saw polls with thousands of answers where it was split 50-50 on whether or not fans wanted Deshaun Watson to be a Seahawk. That's significant. You're talking about a guy who's 25 years old, who's an all-pro caliber player, hasn't even reached the prime of his career. And the Seahawks could conceivably get him, and half the fan base doesn't want him. That tells you everything you need to know. Because I'd say at least 50% of football fans out there just want good players on their team and don't care about what they've done off the field, no matter how bad it is. We see examples of that all around the league. But I would say, even if you forget that for a moment, first of all, he wouldn't be available if it wasn't for that. But let's just hypothetically. The Seahawks, I think, looked themselves in the mirror and realized we need to rebuild this thing. Not a 5-year rebuild. There's some good young talent. There's a foundation on this team. But maybe a 2-year, take a step back, build up the roster, let's go for it next year type of a reset. Why would you trade your icon and get the haul that you got from Denver and put yourself in a position to fill major holes on a roster that's littered with them? This is a flawed roster right now. When you look at today, as we sit here today, you can't count Quandre Diggs. Can't count Rashad Penny. Can't count Dwayne Brown. Those guys are free agents that have not been re-signed yet. This roster has a ton of holes. So now you're going to take all those assets, turn around again, trade him for another guy who's going to eat up a huge part of your salary cap space and is probably going to be suspended. So you're not even going to be able to get on with the process of rebuilding around him. It makes no sense. No sense at all. And now the narrative today is more so along the lines of Buccaneers, Saints, Panthers. So here I put together a plan A, plan B, plan C in this order of what I'd like to see the Seahawks do. What I think makes the most sense. Plan A, I've kind of touched on it already. use those assets. Build the roster this year with picks. Don't use the number 9 pick on a quarterback. Acquire another QB to compete with Locke. I'm all aboard the Gardner Minshew train. I think he'd be ideal in this system. I think he'd have a higher floor, lower ceiling than Locke. Higher floor, though. And I don't think it would cost much to acquire him. You have an extra 5th now from Denver. You could send him that, make it conditional, depending on if he plays enough snaps. It could become a 4 or 3 next year, or you could send him a 4 this year that you could get him for a very reasonable price for a starting quarterback. Or sign a Marcus Mariota and see if he has anything left in the tank at 30 years old, refreshed in a new system. Something along those lines. Acquire another veteran QB to compete with Locke. And then you take your shot next year when you have two first-round picks. Presumably your own will be in the top half because you might be looking at a 7-8 win team. 2 firsts and 2 seconds. You would have the ammo next year to move up. If you like CJ Stroud out of Ohio State, if you like Bryce Young from Alabama, if you like Will Levis, I do, out of Kentucky. These are guys that would be head and shoulders above anything in this draft this year. If these guys were in this draft, I'd be saying, hey, they're sitting pretty. Number 9, take your next guy. Let's go. So that's my plan A. Build the roster this year. Fix the offensive line long-term. Get some answers at tackle. Add to that defense, right? You got a new scheme, so you need another corner. You need another linebacker. I mean, let's get another edge rusher to pair with Darrell Taylor, and let's get that defense young, hungry, fast, and aggressive and move forward with that. And then next year, go after one of those other guys and drop him into a much better situation. And now you have your next franchise quarterback on a rookie deal, and you're off and running. That's the plan I like. Plan B, similar, except you use one of those extra second-round picks. You have the 40th and the 41st pick. You use one of those on a quarterback who falls that you like. Seahawks have been connected with Matt Corral. He's an interesting player. Like him a lot. Injury prone because he just puts his body on the line. Not the safest player, but a fun player. Use one of those seconds. Desmond Ridder, Cincinnati, another guy reportedly that they like, have met with. Could really fit the system. Bigger guy. Take one of those guys in the second round. Let him compete with Locke. Bring Geno Smith back or another veteran quarterback. You still have Jacob Eason on the roster too. Remember, this is a guy who was number 1 recruit in the country a few years ago, transferred to Washington, was talked about as a first-round pick, fell to the middle rounds with the Colts. They let him go. Between he and Locke, you might be hard-pressed to find another roster in the league that has 2 guys with that strong of arms. Hugh Millen once said the day Jacob Eason stepped on campus at UW, he became the guy with the strongest arm in the history of the Husky program. So let those guys compete. Take the second rounder, though, and maybe he becomes your next Russell Wilson, a guy that develops and he's ready to go. And you're only using one of those extra seconds, so you can still do a lot of work with that number 9 pick. You can trade down, pick up extra picks. You have the 41st pick. You have a 3rd, a 4th, 2 fifths. You can really still stack that roster. That's my plan B. My plan C is you use the number 9 pick on a quarterback. And I did not like this idea at all until a few days ago when I started watching quarterbacks. And Malik Willis, it's easy to get excited about this kid when you watch him on tape. There's some level of competition issues. It's hard to evaluate him sometimes because his offensive line was terrible. Although, we don't have to squint very hard to see how much he looks like Russell Wilson, but he's about 3 inches taller. Had a phenomenal combine. Accurate, strongest arm at the combine. Was his deep balls at the combine, you could hear audible oohs and ahs from the people in attendance. He's athletic. Everything I hear about him off the field, this could be the guy. Might not be ready to play as a rookie. Might be more of a Trey Lance type of pick. But a guy you don't have to trade 3 first-round picks to move up and get like Trey Lance. If they are convinced that he's the guy, then I'd be okay taking him at 9 because that's all it would cost you. And then you still have the rest of the draft, including those 2 seconds, to really fill some holes. Before we move on, let's talk about Bobby Wagner. So This one was a little harder to take, not from a football standpoint. I've been saying it for months. Bobby Wagner's essentially done, right? We know the knees are what they are. I know he injured it second to the last game of the season. I waited on him at the restaurant about a month after that. He was moving like my 88-year-old father. There's a huge market for his services now. There's as many as 15 teams that are interested in signing him, and it's going to be hard to see him playing in another uniform. But you're not going to see the same Bobby Wagner we remember. You didn't see the same Bobby Wagner we remember last year. Those 178 tackles are a little bit of a mirage. They weren't the same impact tackles he's had before. He wasn't attacking the line of scrimmage. He wasn't running guys down sideline to sideline. And the reason the Seahawks had to play so conservative on defense last year and had so many of you so upset that they played that way was to cover up for his deficiencies in coverage. Not the same player he was before. And there was no way that you could justify bringing him back at $20 million a year. Now, the hard part of this to digest is Bobby's assertion that nobody contacted him from the team before they released him. If that's true, and I don't see why he would lie, he's a stand-up dude. That's not good. It could be a red flag as you enter into a free agency period where it sounds like the Seahawks are interested in some of the top flight free agents. They usually don't play in that upper tier. But we've been connected to Chandler Jones and some other bigger names out there. I mean, if that perception gets out there, that could be damaging. Now, they've handled other stars better in the past. In fact, Zach Miller, the former tight end, jumped in on Bobby Wagner's Twitter thread and was like, that doesn't sound like Pete and John. Are you sure? Sure they didn't try to get a hold of you? It's concerning. It stinks, especially given that it happened the same day that you move on from Russell Wilson. Probably could have handled that better. But the move from a football standpoint made all sorts of sense. Now you build around Jordan Brooks. You're going to have to add some linebackers, especially moving to a 3-4 scheme. You got Cody Barton, and then that's about it. I do wonder, and this is something we can talk about when I have a guest on. I've always been a big fan of Ben Burke-Kirven. He tore his ACL in the preseason last year. If he comes back healthy this year, he could really thrive, get some significant snaps, I would think, in a 3-4. He's just a tackling machine. He's good in coverage. Always in the right place. Be interesting to see if he kind of figures into their plans a little bit. And maybe even John Radigan, who was a guy out of the Naval Academy or out of West Point last year that they kept around in the practice squad. Bigger guy, could maybe help out rushing off the edge in a 3-4 scheme. But Bobby just wasn't going to match. It wasn't going to fit into that anymore. And especially when you decide to move on from Russell Wilson, you're essentially admitting, hey, we're not going to try to patch these holes and keep this together for one more year to see if we can contend. We need to take a big step back. You knew it was only a matter of time. Let's talk about some baseball. And then this note, in fact, let me check this here. Do this live on the air. Okay. Chris Clough is going to be joining me tomorrow. We'll be live streaming about 9 a.m. and then the show will be available after that on all platforms. Chris Clough, the former Seahawks beat reporter, and has written some books about the Seahawks. Always a great guest, always has great insight. He's been at the forefront the last couple of years of discussing Russell Wilson and talking about how it made no sense to keep him really unless the roster was in better shape. And I'll be fascinated to hear his ideas about what they should do moving forward as well. So Chris Clough will be joining me tomorrow. We'll get a little more in depth about this and do a little bit more looking ahead to free agency and the draft. Let's talk about some Mariners, and there's not much to talk about. Again, let's just do a little check here. So the lockout ended Thursday, and I'm really glad because that day at 3:00 on Thursday, free agency was going to start immediately as soon as they. Okay, I'm just looking at Twitter here to see if there's any breaking Mariner news. There is not. Nothing's happened yet. It's been 3 days. Nothing's happened yet. Some minor signings. There's a thought that everyone's waiting on Freddie Freeman. That's why Trevor Story, Chris Bryant, Michael Conforto, Seiya Suzuki haven't signed yet. That maybe Freeman can set the market a little bit. But we expected this mad, crazy rush of free agent signings. It hasn't happened. We expected like a first day of NFL free agency rush. That hasn't happened. And then Jerry DiPoto came out Friday and did the car wash, went on all the radio shows and talked about how much they like the young players and how getting to see them in camp without the veterans for the last 3 weeks has kind of changed their opinion on a couple of guys. That Julio Rodriguez, when you listen to Jerry DiPoto talk about their top prospect, might be ready now at the age of 19, 20, might be ready to break camp opening day as a starting outfielder with the Mariners right now. That George Kirby might also be just as close to joining the starting rotation. And he talked in terms that make old Mariner fans, it triggers their PTSD, right? We're battered and damaged Mariner fans. We've heard this before. We heard it a year ago. They were supposed to spend last offseason, and then Mather got involved, and they tightened up the purse strings. And Jerry wasn't able to go after a couple of key veterans he wanted to augment the roster last year. So there's a little bit of sense of, oh, here we go again. We're going to talk about going after the big guys, but we're going to miss out on them, and we're going to end up signing some role players. How quickly we forget that we signed the reigning Cy Young Award winner, Robbie Ray, right before the lockout. So let's just mute that argument that they're not going to do anything. But we know that right before the lockout, there were intense conversations with Trevor Story, Chris Bryant, and others. Bryant is a guy I'm on the record as saying I want first and foremost. He can play third base. He can play the corner outfield spots. He can fill in at first base in a pinch. Right-handed power bat. Not the same level of the guy that won Rookie of the Year and MVP a few years ago, but still an all-star caliber player who would be great in your clubhouse, would man the hot corner, and would provide some right-handed pop. Chris Bryant's the guy that I want. He also has a connection. Paul Sewald and him, the Mariners' breakthrough reliever last year, who became their closer, played college baseball together, and Sewald's been openly stumping for him on social media. So we'll see if that works. There's also he and Bryce Harper are best friends. They're both Vegas guys, so the Phillies are in on this as well. But there's a report yesterday, John Heyman said that Trevor Story's not going to happen, that the Mariners offered him $100+ million, but wanted him to move to third base. And he has said all along he doesn't want to. And this is where I get upset sometimes. Some of the local sports radio guys. Some of them are good. Others, I feel like just roll out of bed, go into work, turn the microphone on every day, and just talk. Can I get one of those jobs? But the other day I heard one of them say, I won't mention his name, and he was all over this idea that just sign Trevor Story. I like him better than Brian. He's more athletic. Put him at third. You don't put an all-star free agent, 7-figure, 8, 9-figure player. You don't put that guy anywhere. He decides where he wants to play. If he sees himself as being a shortstop, and the Mariners are committed to J.P. Crawford at shortstop, he's not going to move to third base unless you pay him significantly more than anyone else would. And why would you do that? Plus, there's questions about his elbow. I mean, there's scouts that think he has to move off of short to second because of the elbow issue. So why would you want to put him at third full time? And then Jason Churchill last night said that according to his sources, the Story thing has been dead for months, that they moved on. So it's Bryant or others. Again, I'm all in on Bryant. But if they fail to get Bryant, if we find out today that the Philadelphia Phillies have signed Chris Bryant, and Trevor Story goes wherever he goes, there's some people that think he's waiting on what Correa does, because if Correa signs somewhere other than Houston, that Story would be the fallback plan for the Astros. So if it's not Bryant, don't lose hope. Man, there's a lot of other good options out there. The Mariners have been connected to veteran infielder Jonathan Villar. And if that's the signing, be happy about it. Dude's 30 years old. He's a dependable veteran, good veteran clubhouse presence. He's a switch hitter who can play third and second, good defensively in both areas. Solid hitter with some pop. I think he had 18 home runs last year, can run a little bit. He's exactly the kind of guy you want on your roster if you can't get a Chris Bryant. And then there's still a lot of outfield options. Even though we got, I get it. Haniger, Kelnick, Rodriguez, Kyle Lewis, where are they all going to play, right? First of all, can't count on Kyle Lewis. They say the medical reports are good. They haven't seen him yet. But can he play center field? Can you count on him to play center field every day now with those knees? Not so sure. So you can't count on him. Seiya Suzuki, I think, is still in the mix. There are reports that we're one of the teams that are trying to recruit him, a 27-year-old right-handed power hitter from Japan. And the interesting thing about him is he can play all three outfield spots. You're not going to play him every day in center field, from what I understand. And you want him at a corner because he has such a strong arm. But he can fill in center field. But he can also play in infield. He was an infielder coming up. And then they converted him to the outfield. He'd be a right-hander. So you could add some combination of Villar, who gives you that left-handedness that Jerry DiPoto talked about yesterday. They need to add a left-handed element to the lineup. Gives you that versatility positionally that they love. And Suzuki would give you that right-handed bat. Michael Conforto is out there as well. Pacific Northwest native. Looking to reestablish his value after a down year with the Mets. He might be a guy that's open to a shorter-term contract if he can't get the big multi-year deal that he wants. Left-handed power bat. So he would work well if you do get Chris Bryant. Still a lot of options out there. If they strike out on all of those, then you're looking at the trade route. Maybe you go back and you revisit the Matt Chapman idea from the Oakland A's. Love to have Matt Chapman at third base. Big time power, Gold Glove at third. It would take a little bit to get him. It would take a lot. But it might be worth it. So keep an eye on that. And also remember this. No matter what happens in the next 2 weeks with the Mariners, as far as free agency goes and trades, as much as they have an opportunity to be competitive and be a playoff contender in 2022, especially with the expanded playoffs, now at 12, locked in, it's still going to be a fun year. If you just add a couple of veteran role players to this roster, you still get to watch Kelnick continue to develop, right? The young pitchers to develop. You're going to get to see more of Logan Gilbert and that bullpen. And some of those guys we didn't get to see last year, like Ken Giles. You're going to get to see Julio make his debut, and Kirby, and Matt Brash, and Brandon Williamson, potentially even Emerson Hancock. 2023 is really the year that you hope you have the breakthrough. 2022 is going to be a heck of a lot of fun, whether we get Chris Bryant, Michael Conforto, Seiya Suzuki, or not. So I just wanted to put that back into perspective. It's been fun talking to you guys again. I don't think it went too terribly bad, too horrible. I don't know. Made it through. Everything seemed to work fine. But tomorrow will be a fun day. We're going to do a deeper dive on the Seahawks with Chris Clough. He's going to be joining me. Always a great time talking to him. We'll talk Seahawks free agency. We'll get you ready for the draft. We'll talk quarterback ideas. It'll be a lot of fun. Follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. Until tomorrow, thanks for listening.